sponsored by buyee. Buyee is a premier Japanese import proxy buying service that allows you to get goods from Japan easily. You could use their services with their brand new mobile app, their browser extension, or even just going to the website. In any case, it'll allow you to go ahead and buy from websites such as Mercari Japan, Yahoo Auctions Japan, Surigaya, and even Amazon Japan. There are lots of Megaten merch that you can't really get outside of Japan, and this is the best way to do it. Buyee has given me a brand new URL, and if you use that URL to sign up with Buyee, you get 2,000 yen, or about $20, in coupon form towards the purchase of a new thing using their service. I highly recommend them. I use them all the time. Thanks again, Buyee, for sponsoring this video. There are two pieces of art I believe are emblematic of Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. One is called Birth. This features Demi-Fiend falling. He's being gazed upon by a myriad of demons, including Kukurihime, Nue, Ose, Thor, and Yatagarasu. The colors evoke royalty, a quiet awe, and almost a serenity, not unlike a typical depiction of Jesus Christ's birth. The second one, the one we see time and time again, is called Death. In this, Demi-Fiend is engulfed in a sea of red, presumably Magatsuhi. Surrounding him are the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the fiends who hold the menorah in the game. Holding Demi-Fiend are the red and white riders. The white rider is the polluter of pious people, someone who corrupts faith. He embodies internal warfare and holds the left hand at the wrist. The left hand is often associated with being evil, as this is where the root for the word sinister comes from. Holding the right hand is the red rider, symbolizing spiritual warfare and bloodshed. Panning up, there is Lucifer, staring menacingly down. Above him, the canvas changes to yellow. In the Bible, this is a color often associated with testing faith and purification. This art piece to me symbolizes Demi-Fiend's death. Not a true death, but the death of his humanity. According to producer Koji Okada, the main theme is the creation from chaos. The catchphrase for Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne is, "Tokyo died and I was born." This video will look at the game Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, the HD remaster, and the development, the lore, the gameplay, and what I think about it. This is a deep dive into everything about the game in an attempt to demystify aspects that have confused and eluded fans for a while. Let's look at Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. So I want to create a simple timeline of events so we can see the length of time spent conceptualizing Nocturne. Okada and Kaneko professed to having thought and shot around ideas about Nocturne as early as 1994. They decided, however, to wait until hardware had improved to the point where they can move forward with the design process. By 1999, Atlus had announced 5 or 6 titles that would be released for the PS2, with the first one scheduled to hit shelves in March of 2000. In this announcement, we also got word that they would be releasing at least one new Megami Tensei title for that console. By 2000, they premiered a LAN prototype featuring Cerberus. This prototype used 5 PS2s connected via LAN, with 4 allowing you to play the game and the 5th one allowing you to be a spectator of the events. The game functioned by each player controlling a Cerberus and fighting demons that would appear on the field within a time limit. Shortly after, a more serious but still conceptual side of development was underway, with one of the first things about Nocturne being the design of Demi-Fiend being completed. By 2001, a draft of the game's plot was put to paper. Around this time, we also saw the creation of the Nocturne Alpha, which is described later in this video in more detail and is also shown off in the Nocturne documentary DVD. In 2002, the game reached a more proper stage of development, changing hands from the writing staff from Komura to Isogai. In September of the same year, a playable demo was shown off at Tokyo Game Show, and in February of 2003, the original release of the game came about. This original release had 3 separate editions, the normal, or Standard Edition with the blue cover art, the Tsutaya Edition featuring a new box art, and the Deluxe Pack which featured collectible goodies, but the box art for the game itself was still the same. This was then re-released under the PS2 The Best label, featuring the same blue art inset with a white border surrounding it, at a lower price. The following year, Maniacs was released. This featured a grayscaled box art which was released in limited quantity in Japan. A red tone box art was released in the US, and the PAL region version featured Demi-Fiend's character still on the box with a Dante model, and the now famous featuring Dante from the Devil May Cry series seal. This version was called Lucifer's Call due to the name Nocturne already being copywritten in that region. The PAL region version was released a year after the US and Japanese releases. In 2005, the Maniacs version was reprinted in Japan, again in limited quantities. In 2008, Chronicle Edition was released alongside Raidou 2, the official name on the box being Raidou Kuzunoha vs King Abaddon Plus, and the version of Nocturne that was bundled with Raidou 2 is called Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne Maniacs Chronicle Edition. This box art features Raidou and Dante fighting fiercely. Something seldom mentioned is the fact that the Chronicle Edition actually fixes some minor bugs, including one bug where when you would open a chest with an item, it would also open another chest somewhere else in the world if it featured the same item. They also redid some boss battle patterns, as well as changing some of the boss scene animation. Chronicle Edition also featured save data bonuses, with around 5 or more demons carrying over from the original release or Maniacs release if it's detected on your memory card, but this would not extend to the compendium data or the number of playthroughs completed. In 2014, the game was released on the North American PlayStation Network as the PS2 Classic for the PS3, and in 2015, Europe got the same treatment. Then, in October of 2020 and May of 2021, Nocturne was remastered and re-released as Nocturne HD Remaster. Initially for the Switch and PS4, but the international release added a Steam version as well. This version includes bits of new content and also some quirks. This version improves some graphics, including new textures on the models, new voice acting, as well as DLC, and some tweaks, such as Dante getting the pierce effect that Raidou had, making their skill sets completely identical now, as well as adding skill selection when fusing demons. The DLC included a merciful mode, which acts as an easy mode, Maniacs Pack, which adds the experience of playing the game with Dante, as Raidou was included by default, paid DLC called the Little Lord's Compassion and Lord's Expectations, one offering items that could be used to increase experience towards leveling up, and the other offering items that could be sold for different values of Maka. And finally, the Vortex World background music. These are packs of 2 tracks per game that would play in the overworld and in overworld battles. The game's tracks come from Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, 4, and Final. This release has some quirks that extends to other regions. The Asia releases initially did not include Raidou Kuzunoha, so instead, the game defaulted to the initial release version, with the Maniacs content only being available after the purchase of Dante's DLC. It's important to note, owning both Raidou and Dante does not mean that you can play with both in a single playthrough. Each character is locked behind their mode that's in the title screen, Maniacs mode or Maniacs Chronicle mode. Though the Chinese version eventually added Raidou, explaining that they feared fan response to Raidou's outfit, as the reason why they didn't include him initially. When he was added, he was free for about a month, and has hereafter become paid DLC in that region. The Korean and Hong Kong versions still do not feature Raidou, and there is no official response as to why. Other oddities about this release include its initial release, which had significantly worse gameplay standards when compared to every prior release. This included significant slowdown during battles when traversing some locations, when demons are hinting that they will evolve, when skills like Tornado or Charge are used, when new demons join an encounter, when the menu is used, especially if navigating to look at the demons or the player status or changing Magatama, when saving. This was reduced in the 1.02 patch, and this is also where skill selection was added. After this, by default, Demon Fusion would shuffle the skill. Additional shuffling could be activated via a button press, and a second button press would bring up a menu where you can select skills. Most slowdown and frame rate stability issues were addressed but only reduced, not removed. A further update, the 1.03 update, improved the stability but still offers slowdown and frame rate drops that are very visible depending on which console you play on, with the Nintendo Switch version being the most noticeable. the PS4 version being less noticeable than that, the Pro version being even less noticeable, and with the PS5 version being almost indistinguishable from the initial release. The game being released in the West added another peculiarity, due to the fact that the Steam version would be available in Asian regions. Because it's available in Asian regions that don't have Raidou, the game defaults to the initial release version instead of the Raidou version, with the Raidou version being unlockable via free DLC instead, in order to make Raidou inaccessible to regions that do not have Raidou currently in their game. This would then mean that the Steam version is the only one in English offering all three experiences of Nocturne. Nocturne was the first numbered title released in 9 years following Shin Megami Tensei 2's release. It is not a sequel to any of the games in the franchise and features a completely new Earth with a new set of rules and new governing deity. This shifted away from the first-person perspective to the third, to illustrate the scale of the environment and to avoid the developers' fears of triggering 3D motion sickness. The game uses a cel-shaded art style. This was a design choice born from both their need to differentiate Atlus from the crowd, as many studios were trying to be more photorealistic, and Atlus instead wanting to stand out, but also replicate Kazuma Kaneko's art style the best way they could. This is why in the files for the game you can find characters from previous Atlus titles, such as Sid Davis, Lucifer, Maya, and Lisa. Some of these characters were used for stand-ins for other characters that would be included in the game, as is the case with Lisa, but also they were used to just replicate Kaneko's style to see how they can best represent it using this new hardware. This idea of representing Kaneko's art style faithfully dates even further back to the Cerberus tech demo, which shows a slightly different rendering style. Even further, the game Makken X, released in 1999, which was one of the games that they used to hone the team's skill as they transitioned into 3D. The designs transitioned to 3D were also supervised by Kaneko, in the sense that he would watch their development of the models and gave advice and feedback when the full design from behind was shown. On whole, the groundwork for Nocturne's graphics took about half a year to set up. It's important to note that there's 3 versions of this game. The original release, which does not include the Amala Network, Fiend Boss Battles, or Lucifer Ending, or TDE as it's called in the West. This version of the game was directed by Katsura Hoshino, written by Shogo Isegai and Hiroshi Kimura. The Maniacs version was directed by Kazuyuki Yamai and has an additional writing credit, also being Kazuyuki Yamai. This would indicate that the additional events that were added, including the Amala Theater exposition, were likely written by Yamai himself. The reason for Nocturne being re-released from the initial release to Maniacs was to facilitate completing the intended narrative. So, this would then mean that nearly all or most of the new content from the initial release to Maniacs may have been intended from the beginning. Kaneko himself saying fans might want to consider the Maniacs version as the complete edition or the deluxe edition of the game. Speaking of Yamai, in Tokyo Game Show 2003, when discussing the differences in the releases between Nocturne and Maniacs, they also explained why Dante appeared in Maniacs at all. The story is quite simple. Kazuma Kaneko is speaking to Tanaka Tsuyoshi, the producer of Devil May Cry 2, about the future of the gaming industry. Yamai had mentioned previously that he would want to see Dante included in the game, so Kaneko passed this sentiment on to Tsuyoshi. Okada and the development staff created a preview of Dante's first appearance, using the design from the Devil May Cry 2 art book as a base and sent it over to Capcom, and it was approved. Kaneko would also go on to design devil triggers for Dante and Virgil in Devil May Cry 3. Kimura is a pretty impressive character, having developed his own cult classic, Kowloon's Gate, a PS1 adventure game delving into the supernatural, that recently had a sequel announced in 2019 that's meant to release in Japan in 2021, called Kowloon's Rhizome. Kimura's involvement is hard to describe, as according to him, he was responsible for the scenario writing from November 2001 to April 2002. Some remnants of his version include the term Devil Hearts. This is relevant because it's also the name of an art piece, one of the first promotional art pieces presumably by Kazuma Kaneko for the promotion of Nocturne. In his version, it seems that Devil Hearts was the name for Magatama, and the tagline of this version of the story was, "If we can bring down the gods and reveal the truth, we could become the founders of a new world." Because of the inclusion of the phrase Devil Hearts in the Nocturne Alpha, we can presume that this is probably a remnant from Kimura's design. Not much else is known about this version of the game, but from the brief notes that Kimura mentions, we know that Gozu Tenno also had a reason, implying that the mantra had a larger role than what we got in the final game. Tenno's reason was Masuda. The only remnant of this is that in the final game, the name of the song that plays when you encounter him is also called Masuda. In the liner notes for the OST, Shoji Meguro also confirms that this is indeed what this is referencing. Kimura also mentions that he was responsible for developing characters, events, and map composition. In fact, he is still credited in all versions of the game except Nocturne HD Remaster, which removes and reassigns credits of many of the original staff. What I mean by that is that nearly all staff credits are removed from the game's roster, and some names are given different roles, possibly indicating that the people who got different roles are people who returned to the game, while others didn't return for the remaster project. Shogo Isegai is another writer for Nocturne, and he's a man that I've been propping up as an important figure in the Nocturne or Atlas pantheon that goes largely unnoticed by modern fans. He's responsible for coming up with the Akira route in Shin Megami Tensei If, Majin Tensei 1's plot, penning Soul Hackers, as well as coming up with the setting and fusions for that game, and writing most of the Trauma Center series, as well as writing Strange Journey. He also might hold the record for most characters from Atlas titles being based on him, with Detective Isono from Devil Summoner, Isono's nephew Tsutomi from Revelations Persona or Ibanroku Persona, Edogawa from Persona 3, and the speech patterns for characters like the Child Mannequin in Nocturne and Obadian and McCoy's speech patterns from Soul Hackers and Raidou also being based on Isegai's unique way of speaking, dubbed Gain Speech by Atlas and fans of Atlas at the time. Isegai also shares some insights about the writing. He mentions how in the 90s, the scale of the enemies included a variety of humans, and there were also human allies as well. But within Nocturne, the challenge was creating a sympathetic story with less human characters to facilitate that. For this game, Atlas wanted to display different styles and reasons for living. According to Atlas, there are the type of people who will always take the initiative, there's a type that doesn't really understand what's going on but will follow those in power, the type that says that everyone should be individuals, and of course, many other small types and subdivisions. And this is why they made reasons to represent those. For research, Atlas would look at systems in society such as school systems, governmental entities, and clubs to incorporate this culture into the Vortex world. Okada also told the team developing the map design that Tokyo itself is a dungeon, and that SMT should embody the word dungeon. The spherical Tokyo, or Vortex world, was born from concepts Kaneko had interpreted, such as the bubble structure of the universe from cosmology, the Gnostic spherical structure of the universe, and the hollow world theory. It's important to note that I could not find much in the way of information about the Gnostic spherical structure or the bubble structure of the universe. Kaneko says that for Shin Megami Tensei, the devil summoning program is emblematic of the franchise. He compares it to the lightsaber for Star Wars or the belt in Kamen Rider. And translating that to Nocturne was a challenge. With the desire to keep the concept of this world different, he considered how he can readapt the devil summoning program without actually using it. So immediately following the praise received at Tokyo Game Show with the Cerberus display, Atlas began working on the Protagonist for Shin Megami Tensei 3. For Demi-Fiend, there's individual themes he's meant to represent and is presenting in his story and design. His tattoos are meant to evoke shamanistic ritual magic, a solution to the concept of the devil summoning program existing in Nocturne. And it's more meant to be a stigma rather than tattoos. They follow the lymphatic system of his body. His eye color changing from gray to yellow or red is also symbolic, tying back to the constant use of red in this game, and both colors tying back to the art called death. His horn is actually a sensory organ that functions like a primitive brain, which the Magatama controls. This design decision was based on something Kaneko had heard, that when looking at a person's aura from profile view, you can see their energy spiking on the back of their neck. If we look at his name, we get even more evidential meaning. In the Japanese version, he's called Hiroshura. This is from Ningen and Ashura. It takes the first character from Ningen, Hito, and the final two characters from Ashura, and thus we get Hiroshura. Shura or Ashura are just the Japanese way of referring to Asura, a Buddhist demigod of war, to put it simply. But colloquially, this is also used to describe someone who's fighting an endless war against something in a relentless and inhumane manner, often fueled by helplessness, anger, and emotion. This relates very closely to the journey of Demi-Fiend. Though the tattoos are meant to replace the need for a comp, that actually wasn't the first idea. One idea presented early on by Cosmo Kaneko would have had a body techno-horror approach. In referencing the film Videodrome, Kaneko suggested an earlier idea that would have had Demi-Fiend fused with a comp in some way. Koji Okada talked about the development of Demi-Fiend and how important it was to decide if the main character is the player, or whether they are a means by which the story is told to the player. Presenting Demi-Fiend the way Nocturne does tries to engage the question, how does the player feel? Are you okay with humanity being ripped from you? Are you okay with following someone else's wishes, whether they are friend or supernatural, or would you rather return the world and regain your humanity? The music for this was composed by Shoji Meguro, with sound creator credits going to Toshiko Tasaki and Kenichi Tsuchiya. When writing the music for Nocturne, Meguro was focused on staying true to the themes of the game and expressing emotions he felt while watching cutscenes and gameplay footage. For Tokyo Conception, Meguro composed the track while watching the footage. Title Loop 2 is Meguro's favorite track, and it was a composition he made very early on in development when he was working on battle music. Knowing that it didn't quite fit as a battle track, he instead used it as a reoccurring melody interwoven into Nocturne. The Reason boss battle track was one requested to him by Daisuke Kaneda. Since the game was in the mastering phase, Meguro originally told him no, but later decided to do it anyways after seeing how sad he looked. The sound of the game was meant to keep in theme with the soundscape of the first two games, a sound that Meguro called Masuko Rock, named after Tsukasa Masuko, the original composer for Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2. He even gave the music from Nocturne a 80s sound to further the connection to the older games and to provide some feeling of nostalgia. The design of the battle music is also worth noting, as Meguro created many guitar solos and flares to randomly play so the song could feel fresh and not get tiring. The CG for the demons to some degree were outsourced to Digital Media Lab, a company that has confusing ties to Atlus. The CG animation to Persona 2 was done by them, modeling for Shin Megami Tensei 9, and the event animation for Catherine Full-Body were all contributions from Digital Media Lab. And Shirogumi, a company specializing in animation, special effects, filmmaking, and production, also has the credits of CG demons. Their claim to fame for video game realm stuff is the cutscene animation and opening animation segments that they are prone to do. Having done work with Atlus, including the animation for Raidou Kuzunoha vs. the Soulless Army, and some animation work for Persona 5. I want to talk briefly about the narrative featured in the alpha build of the game. This description largely comes from the Lost Media Wiki. The game would begin by Anat awakening Demi-Fiend by the power of Devil Hearts. This would later be known as Magatama in the final game, and even the art featuring Lucifer is called Devil Hearts in reference to this, and order him to kill Amaterasu, who is trying to hunt down a treasure and make Dark Tokyo her own. Demi-Fiend would then meet Take Mikuzuchi, who tells him that Amaterasu was cursed by Anat, and by her grief she hid in a monkey enclosure in Ueno Zoo. This area would later become Yoyogi Park in the final game. He then tells Demi-Fiend that he needs to find the treasure to undo the curse on Amaterasu. You would then get two choices, either side with Take Mikuzuchi and help save Amaterasu, or still go by the plan that Anat had given you. If you decide to help Amaterasu, Demi-Fiend would cross the waters of the Shinobazu Pond and meet Nue, which, after negotiating, he would help Demi-Fiend navigate the depths of the pond. Demi-Fiend would then go to the bottom of the pond and find a tunnel to a cave. Once in, he would find the treasure and return it to Take Mikuzuchi. He and Demi-Fiend would then undo the curse and the demo ends. On the flip side, however, if you decided to stick with Anat's plan, Demi-Fiend would have to kill Take Mikuzuchi and find out that Amaterasu escaped to the Imperial Palace. By negotiating with demons, you find out where that is, but there's a barrier in your path. Anat appears and breaks that barrier for you, and then you fight Amaterasu. Once defeated, the demo ends. It's also interesting that you could jump from this version of the events to the other version, or to the beginning of both parts. When Nocturne was first released, there was a lot of points of contention amongst the existing fans of the franchise. Common complaints included not enough demons, no story connection between Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2, it's too difficult, demon negotiation is too simple, there's not enough unique dialogue for demons to have, story was confusing or non-existent, the lack of a heroine, and no armor or equipment. While these complaints persisted, the game would eventually become well received amongst the fans in Japan, with over 245,000 units sold in the initial run, which was sold at a value of 7,800 yen, which is roughly $76. This number was approximately 75% of the total stock. This version also launched alongside the deluxe edition for 12,800 yen. This edition featured a cash cube design, as well as a Amalodrome incense burner and incense in the same style presented in game. There was also a CD that featured songs that were meant to be played during the burning of specific incenses, i.e. the strength incense being burned while the strength track played. The Maniacs run, however, only sold 77,000 units, and the Chronicle one is a bit tricky. As this version was a limited run, much like the Maniacs release, the exact sales numbers are pretty hard to track, especially when factoring this was released alongside the first run of Raidou 2. So Chronicle was packaged with Raidou 2, sold as Raidou 2 Plus, and as a result, the numbers between that and the first run of Raidou 2 are conflated. The total for the sales of this game being 162,000 units. But considering Raidou 1 only sold 91,000 units, we can attribute a low number of the sales being the Chronicle bundle. On August 5th, 2004, the regular version was released as PlayStation Best at the low price of 2,800 yen, but this was not the version that featured Raidou Dante. When discussing the sales and how surprisingly low Maniac and Chronicle Edition sales seem to be, it's important to remember that these were limited runs. To exemplify this, Until the release of Nocturne HD, the second-hand price for any of these games ran from $50 to $100, depending on many factors, whereas the initial run version, the blue version, the vanilla version, the Sritaya version, would consistently net $5 to $30 max. So in saying that, and remembering Yamai's statement that the motivation for the HD remaster was to make Dante and Raidou more accessible, only complements the idea that these games just weren't in circulation. During the initial release of the game, Nocturne had a small bit of promotion and collaboration, the promotion being a celebration called Megaten Devilion. Fans were able to attend via a lottery-based ticket distribution system. This event would include quizzes, cosplay competitions, showing off various other Atlas and Megaten related things that were going to happen, a Q&A from the Devil Summoner TV show cast, but the overall focus of this was Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, and there would be a collaboration with NEC Corp, resulting in a Megaten-centric laptop, with the laptop having custom decals to represent the Demi-Fiend's tattoos. Sound effects from the games would be put into the laptop, as well as icons, wallpapers, and screensavers all being canonical art from the Megami Tensei series. Buying this laptop would also net you an opportunity to join a group chat with Koji Okada and Kazuma Kaneko. The price of this laptop was about $1,900 in today's value of money. This was also done in the West during Nocturne's Western release, but instead of NEC, Atlas USA partnered with Falcon Northwest. This was a giveaway via sweepstakes. The laptop's decor mimicked the NEC laptop's design, but without all the interesting wallpapers and sound effects and opportunity to talk to Koji Okada and Kaneko. Interestingly enough, the laptop was also available for purchase via emailing Atlas directly, though the price and how many units sold are unknown. For this, I'll be focusing on some of the lore that might confuse people, but it also contains spoilers, so if you don't want to see me talk about specific spoilers as it relates to the different characters and setting, then go ahead and skip to this part of the video. Nocturne begins in the early 2000s and with a phone call. You are supposed to meet your friends at a nearby park and you're late. You encounter a strange man at the park explaining that the park massacre that you've been hearing about is actually something more. It was a fight between the Messiahs and the Gaians. These are the two rival factions pivotal to the narrative in Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2, but in Nocturne it's a bit different. The Ring of Gaia in some part is led by a man whom you meet at the hospital, where you are supposed to visit your teacher, who is said to be there. The man is Hikawa. Hikawa, at some point before the start of the game's events, finds the scripture of Moroku and learns from it. He learns about the process called the conception and how to make a special prayer wheel called the Amalodrum. In his research, he learns that the Gaians can create a world based on an ideology of their choosing. Compelled to stop the Gaians by a godly voice, the Messiahs wage war against them and fail, because after the protagonist meets up with his two friends and has a near-death encounter with Hikawa and a Baphomet, the world does indeed end, and everyone not inside the hospital as the conception occurs cannot participate in the creation of the next world. The protagonist is greeted by a mysterious voice, Kagatsuchi. He tells the protagonist that he does not have a reason for being and cannot create a new world without this, but encourages the protagonist to go forward, maybe in the hopes of developing a reason. The protagonist encounters a boy and an elderly woman. This pair was visible as you made your way to the rooftop, and you're told the young boy has taken a shine to you. He and the old woman give you a curse in the form of the Magatama, who is now no longer human. He is now the Demi-Fiend. His loss of humanity removes his ability to create the new world. Next, you re-encounter Hijiri in your exploration of the demonic version of the hospital. Hijiri has not survived the conception. In the Kalpa dialogue, you find out that he's being punished for a mortal sin he has committed prior to the events of the game. He's actually a being called a mannequin. More on that later. You then move to an elevator which triggers a test of sorts. Now you meet a young woman and an old man. This pair was an addition for the Maniacs version of Nocturne. Kaneko designed this with intention. The concept was the intellectual looking child seeing from the beginning to the end and looking towards the future, and the old man who views the present in a considerate manner, and depending on the player's choice, a sinister demon. The old woman and the lady in mourning fulfill the same loop, as the Vortex world functions as a womb realm and requires a woman in order to reach the end and the beginning. Kaneko explains this well. According to him, the Earth itself is a living organism. If we were to compare the Earth to a human body, then the existence of humans would be to it on the level of quarks, or maybe something bigger like atoms, or maybe even mitochondria. The relationship between humans and the Earth are supposed to be symbiotic, and maybe it's because of that society hasn't been doing well. Earth as a living organism thinks that it's dying, so what comes next naturally is rebirth. The people who are active on the surface are declining, and the energy that had been circulating up to that point has to gather somewhere, and that space is the vortex world. Part of why the vortex world is shaped spherically is in order to replicate the egg shape. So simply put, the vortex world is like an egg, or the power from which the next world will hatch. It's the very soul of the world. In talking about Lucifer himself, in the game he's just there to tempt the player and give him trials to test him. So don't consider him evil necessarily. While further traversing the vortex world, you'll encounter spirits, or Shinintai, in the Tokyo Conception. All those who were outside the boundaries of Shinjuku Hospital perished. However, those who had some strong commitment in their hearts were allowed to survive the conception and exist in the form of a thought body. And the souls of those who could not even become spirits are circulating in the vortex world as pure energy, Magatsuhi. People who once had supremacy over the world are now mere memories of the world, or fuel for the world. I mentioned Hijiri earlier and how he did not survive. Well, there are entities that also exist in the vortex world that resemble humans. They are mannequins. Hijiri, as you see him post-conception, is actually a mannequin. Let's go over what these are. Mannequins are the descendants of human beings, just like the thought bodies, or souls. They are produced from the mud in and around a place called Mufanashiro in Asakusa. I tried digging into the info of what the Mufanashiro could be referencing, and the only thing I was able to find is Mufanashiro, a sort of ritual vessel made of wood written about in the Ingishiki. The mannequins seem to only have emotions left from their humanity, as opposed to the thought bodies or spirits, though they have some faint memories of humanity, which causes them to act like regular people. They don't necessarily have souls, they just simply consist of memories and emotion. And this ties back to an ancient Japanese belief that human-shaped objects have souls. And although mannequins don't technically have a soul, it may be possible for them to have a will of their own and take the place of the people they once were. Because of this, some mannequins actually do this to some degree, with Hijiri being the main example and Fudamimi and Sakahagi being other examples. Their motherland being Asakusa isn't by mistake, by the way. This is supposed to tie back to the Edo period Asakusa, which was rife with brothels. In the way the women of the brothels were trapped and used, the mannequins are meant to parallel. In fact, the mud that they are said to be made of is said to come from Ohaguro sewage. Ohaguro was a Heian and Edo fad, which involved staining the mouth black using iron and vinegar. And I just have to add that this information was mentioned by Atlas themselves in one of the Nocturne guidebooks. I do not personally see how this connects to all of the mannequins and their plight, and this seems like added detail just for added detail's sake. But the juxtaposition of these oppressed peoples residing in a formal red light district that also holds religious imagery and the mannequins being devout in their faith is very interesting concepts to mix. Now let's explain why demons are even in the vortex world. After the conception, demons seem to have suddenly appeared in the vortex world, but in fact, they had already existed in the world before. However, they lived in a slightly different dimension than the ones humans live in. They can only be removed from their plane of existence through a special summoning method. We see an example of this when Hikawa summons Baphomet, seemingly using the computer technology and the Amala drum, symbolizing again this sort of circular existence, the old and the new working together. The vortex world, which exists in preparation for the world to come, has extracted and concentrated the components of the former world. The human world and the demon world in which they live have become one. In other words, they are survivors from the old world as well, just like humans, but their plane of existence is separate from our own. I wanted to add a little brief note about the Amala network. I've discussed the Amala network in another video, but I did just want to mention simply that the Amala exists outside the vortex world in its own interdimensional plane. I think it's interesting that in this game, the progression of each reason holding character is shown similarly. We get a general idea of who they are at first in their initial dialogue, and then again in their post-conception dialogue, with the conception world teaching us more and more as they begin to change. When we first see Hikawa, he enjoys the silence, and when we first see him in the Vortex world, we see a little bit more into what he means by that. He expounds the true meaning of Shijima, a passionless world where individuality does not exist, and that humanity would exist as merely cogs in the machine of the universe, devoid of negative action at the cost of all action. The fact that his demonic sponsor is the chief evil spirit in Zoroastrianism, whose name literally translates to evil spirit, tells you the idea of silence has been polluted in some way. In mythology, Ahriman rivals Spenta the creative spirit. He creates vices and stillness to fight the creations of Ahura Mazda. The name Shijima refers to silence or stillness. Nihilo comes from the Latin word meaning nothing, and even the initial pose Ahriman takes is meant to evoke Zazen, the monk meditating pursuing nothingness. For Osamu, you are treated to a bit of his need to depend on others. He's well aware of you as the key to him making a pass at the teacher, Mr. Kao. When he's captured by Mantra, he's expectant for help. And finally, when you find him at Kubukicho prison, he's discovered the use of the Amala drum, and he's furious at you and himself for how helpless he was and how you couldn't show up when he needed you most. And that because he's been alone for so long, he should then consciously make the choice to be alone. This becomes so perverse that by the time he reaches his demonic sponsor, Noah, representative of the level of solitude Osamu desires, as Noah is the name Osamu gives the sponsor, who is so forgotten and so far removed that it no longer had a name. Interestingly, his reason's name is Musubi, which in Shinto belief is the power of creation. The name Noah is also a direct reference to the character from the Bible. For Chiaki, there's a general observation where she thinks highly of herself pre-conception. The way that she has you look for the teacher as opposed to her doing so, the way she criticizes the way Osamu is as a character. Her concern for seeking out Mr. Kao isn't because she's worried for Yuko, but rather because she cares about her future and values Takao as someone who can give her advice and guidance. She begins to confirm her perceived belief when she is able to escape the hospital with sheer intelligence and mental fortitude alone. When you meet her in the conception, she expresses some fear and concern for your well-being, but resolves to find Osamu and Yuko alone. Because of the power of the demons, she begins to value their dynamic and sees that she needs to be strong in all aspects to be of value. Her demonic sponsor is Baal. According to Kaneko, the use of the word avatar in the name Baal Avatar is meant to refer to the concept that this is an incarnation of Baal in human form. By her being fused with Baal, she is thus an avatar to him. To iterate on this interpretation, and what Kaneko has said about this version of Baal is that Baal is a male deity who presides over storms and thunderstorms and is worshipped in the Mediterranean, and that this design was dictated partially by the way Baal fuses with Chiaki, with the core concept of the design being meant to evoke angelic imagery. Something I found interesting is that Baal Avatar is listed as a light demon, Ahriman is listed as a neutral demon, and Noah is listed as a dark demon in the Cosmoconical Works, Volume 3. The last person I wanted to mention is Yuko herself. She functions as the maiden by which the world is reborn into the womb state. After she does this, she is brought to the obelisk where she's farmed for Magetsuhi, and later she decides that she wants to create a new world, but does so by making a pact with the unrecognized god, Aradia, and before even this, she isn't able to form her reason, and thus she'll offer you an alternative. So let's talk about the non-reason endings. Of course, I want to go over the worst ending first. True demon ending. One thing you hear from Hikawa is that he's merely a priest of the reason of Shijima, whereas by deciding to side with him, you are truly the creator of the world he desires. All the reasons function like this. They are there to goad you into siding with their ideology. True demon ending is a bit different. True demon ending is part of a long-term game Lucifer has planned. Remember, the Demi-Fiend is a fusion of human and Asura, whereas the reasons are trying to appeal to your humanity, however skewed those worlds might actually be. For Lucifer, he's testing you, and since he fragmented your humanity, he's also testing the effects of what he did. By feeding you the Magatama and turning you into a demi-fiend, and by the lady in black and old woman being very similar to Yuko in presentation and their role, Lucifer is not so subtly manipulating you. It's simply in the name Hiroshura, Hiro being in reference to his humanity, and Shura being reference to Asura. In the same way Asura seek power, you seek power, while also the part of you that's still human seeks humanity. By appealing to both fronts, true demon ending is Lucifer turning you into his ultimate tool. Once he tests you, and you follow through defeating all the fiends, he asks you if you are interested in pursuing his vision, the breaking of the cycle, and becoming a general in his army to wage war against the Great Will. The final portion of the final cutscene shows Yatagarasu flying off. These are supposed to be messengers to God, so the presumption is that they are flying off to tell the Great Will what has happened to this Earth's conception. Part of why I view this as the worst ending is that narratively, this means that Demi-Fiend has not made a choice, as he truly is a victim of abuse in this circumstance. You're being pushed into something against your will. This ending has the most content, but at the cost of truly getting the player to think about their decisions. The next ending I want to discuss is the demon ending. In this, you don't side with Lucifer, and you also never form your own reason. This ending is interesting for many reasons. While this ending more or less is a dud, it implies something that Kagetsuchi mentions at the very beginning, that you do not have any strong will, thus you cannot create a reason. This ending is a not so subtle reference to the way that even your teacher does not have a strong will and thus cannot create a reason. In this ending, you're told by Kagetsuchi that you currently don't have a hint of a reason, and with this, the expectation is that by searching through the Vortex world, you might actually have found one. This ending implies that the Demi-Fiend just doesn't have a strong vision. This ending has both Kagetsuchi and Lucifer insulting you, and it's very interesting because you get to see how Lucifer truly sees you, as he will abandon you in this ending and go on to the next world, meaning that despite everything you've done past his tests, you're just as replaceable as anyone else. This ending results in a permanent vortex world inhabited by demons. The last ending is my favorite ending. Simply Dad mentioned something in his Shin Megami Tensei 4 video that I think applies here. After getting the reason endings, demon ending, and TDE, you can get the teacher ending, or freedom ending. This kind of displays the kindred nature of Yuko and Demi-Fiend, almost giving them a similar path. While Yuko was able to set the events into motion, birthing the Vortex world, Demi-Fiend is able to forge the new world. Neither have a strong vision, so creating a world for them is just impossible. Interestingly, Kagetsuchi compares you to Lucifer in this ending, stating that you are too interested in the freedom that you have gained through the process of the game. Lucifer in this ending warns you that you will be hunted down by the Great Will, because, in a way, freedom ending also breaks the cycle. By returning the world, you didn't actually participate in the cycle of death and rebirth. Instead, you hit rewind. The fact you and your friends remember the events that transpired gives this an emotional weight and implications that are far more interesting to me than the idea that you will fight the Great Will, because even in that scenario, the Great Will is so powerful that even its avatars can't truly hear or understand him. I have compared Lucifer's manipulation of Demi-Fiend to a human controlling the path of an ant. The Great Will would be the next logical step of that analogy, a force so powerful and unfathomable to humans that we wouldn't understand the way that we too are being directed. So with that lore stuff out of the way, let's review the game. The way I feel about Nocturne is unique, probably. It was my first game in the series, and I beat it all without a guide or online help at the tender age of 15 or so, in the Bone Age, around 2005. Most of the meaningful stuff just flew over my tiny teenage brain, and I liked it for years without any real reason or merit besides that I enjoyed the time that I played it when I was a kid. But in late 2020, I started playing Nocturne to bits. I beat it in Japanese on the Switch, PS4, PS5, in Chinese on the PS4, in English on the PS5. I emulated it on my laptop. I did extensive research on the lore. So let's talk about the art. The art style is near peak Kaneko, and it's a chef's kiss, to be honest. I think the effort put into faithfully representing Kaneko's art truly paid off here, as it's something to me that stands the test of time. Even playing the PS2 version, I was very much still in awe when I walked in and saw the Hikawa cutscene, by far one of my favorite moments in the game. A lot of what I like about the game is the visual storytelling. Looking at the way they play with the human form and the transformations that Isamu and Chiaki go through, their humanity is at odds with the influence of the demonic sponsor, but the changes are so small and indicative of their reasons. A strong arm for Chiaki, sharp edges for her hair, and her mouth is obscured to hide her intent. Isamu wants to be alone, and this is shown by wailing, sorrowful faces across his body. I love the way this game takes clear inspiration from film, in the way that its cutscenes often take a deliberate and considerate filmmaking perspective. One comparison I often like to think about is the way that it uses color and how reminiscent it is of the movie Suspiria. The way the lighting and colors play in the scenes, like the Hikawa scene at Nihilo, is haunting and beautiful. Though the action and drama in these scenes are well stated, I'd say there's failings in the battle animations and the walking and running of Demi-Fiend. He moves so awkwardly, and the fighting doesn't ever have this true weight, so all the hits lack that emphasis that would create the heft to the blow. And while many of the demon animations are great, some of them are very unusual and ill-fitting in my opinion. While I'm very much appreciative of the way the game looks, I will say that the HD remaster doesn't exactly enhance much of the game. It seems like most of the enhancements come from the character sprites and the demons, which all have improved textures. Background textures are often very, very low quality, to the point where I don't know how much of it is actually improved outside of the initial parts of the game that most people would see. By the time you get to moments like in the diet building, you can clearly see the resolution of objects not being as high and in depth as areas in the hospital were. And then areas like the underground tunnels are also very poorly optimized, looking even more dated and like a PS2 game rather than a remastered PS2 game. The music isn't my favorite. You can tell how I feel about the music when my favorite tracks from Nocturne are the staff roll and an unused sound test that I use in virtually all my videos. This game does a great job at working within its limits and being unique in regards to the many fills and solos to spice up the music, as well as the injection of a reoccurring melody and the evolution of the melodies in the game. I find that while I never truly jam out outside a few choice tracks, nothing ever feels bland or unnecessary. Instead, the music largely feels immersive. The moment you first see Chiaki, which is a moment I like to call the day of Hee-Ha, the music complements the atmosphere and guts you. It's also worth noting that some of the voice acting performances really stuck with me and sounded great, especially Japanese voice acting. However, most of the English voice acting cast, while they tried their best, I just don't buy them as the characters. I feel that a lot of the voice direction wasn't optimized, and even more, some of the characters are just simply miscast. This is especially prevalent in the Fiends. One thing to consider is the audio compression, something that actually removes from the quality. This was originally done so they can fit everything onto the PS2 disc, which was fine on the PS2, but we encounter that same sort of issue in the remaster, and it's a nasty blow to the overall quality of the remaster. To add to this, there's no official statement as to why this is, and Atlas West seems to be very well aware of it, as they removed audio from the promotional videos they were posting, seemingly due to the criticism regarding the music and audio being compressed. I think the lack of transparency is a horrible move. As to why we didn't get the HD audio, one can assume the old files were not archived. Old files meaning the solos and fills Meguro recorded. This would require either re-recording or using CD rips and then manipulating them in some way. And while this is ideal, they would have likely wanted Meguro to work on this, and due to the fact that he's working on 2 other games, I think that could have been a roadblock. But because we didn't get it, nor did we get an explanation, it makes the decision to have the compressed audio, in conjunction with the price point being nearly full priced for a current gen game, the criticism is valid. And while it might not bother me that much that the audio is compressed, it just needed to be HD or explained. Instead of hiring a pianist to make a piano arrangement CD, they could have just done this proper and have any of the competent creators at Atlas just recreate Meguro's work. I think with gameplay, I'm not the most interesting judge of this. It's never been something I cared to think about. I feel that when I don't have any true complaints, then the gameplay is good, or even great. For Nocturne, I seriously enjoyed a lot of aspects of the game that fans might complain about, one of the things being the dungeon design. I love the dungeon design in Nocturne, especially in places like Kabukicho Prison, the diet building, the obelisk. They're all fun for me. And when people say they don't like that in Nocturne, or Strange Journey, or DDS even, I'm just convinced they don't actually like dungeon crawlers. But for Nocturne, it's fun. It's very engaging. The dungeon gimmick is always something that's fun to do. whether it's using the light ball or teleporting. I find it enjoyable, especially within the confines of Nocturne. The way you don't have equipment or weapons is kind of interesting, and the way Magatama replaced that is very interesting. Being able to get a lot of these different things that then allow you to create your own version of Demi-Fiend is amazing and interesting, and I found it to be a very engaging way to design the character leveling up. Demons actually leveling up as opposed to just being whatever level they are that you recruit them at is a milestone that people don't often recognize that Nocturne set forward. It's enjoyable to experiment with demon fusion in this game, even though it does have a small roster of demons. The fact that you can use skill selection to make a demon that you really like a demon that you can use throughout the whole game is awesome as well. I also enjoy how speedy auto battle is. If you're someone who has gotten to the point where battling the random occurring demons is not too worrying, auto battle feels snappy and quick. But I will say that a complaint I have is that there isn't really a safe area, so there's not really an area where you're just not going to encounter demons. And while that might not be a problem for some, I find it to be a thing that would turn off a lot of new players. It's a bit of a negative to not be able to have this quiet area. Demon evolution is also very interesting because it encourages the idea of leveling demons. The concept of leveling demons being new to Shin Megami Tensei at this time means that by having demon evolution, people will have an incentive to use different types of demons to see which ones actually can evolve. And I like that. I find that to be a very smart way of showing off a new feature. Building off of what I said about Magatama, Demi-Fiend is pretty flexible. You can build a physical build for Demi-Fiend, a magic build, or a mix. And I'm very pleased with the amount of flexibility because magic build is just as viable, if not more so, than fizz build. And I find myself using that or a hybridized version of Demi-Fiend nearly every single time I play through this game. I also like that this game actively engages you most of the time, and it punishes you if you don't play it the way you want to. For me, that's a positive, but I could see that as a huge negative, as people don't necessarily want the narrative by talking to demons, NPCs, or even just exploring. Sometimes people want the most traditional form of dialogue in the form of long exposition by main characters and a lot of interaction between human characters. This game doesn't have a lot of human characters and doesn't have a lot of human interaction. And I think the isolation is part of the experience, and I value that part of the experience. I found the battle system fun overall, and I never felt too beat down by bosses, all of which tended to be really similar, with exception to a couple of key ones like Ongyoki, which I liked as a means by which to keep the player engaged in what they were doing. The worst bosses were bosses like the Fiends and Mott, which were simple and repetitive, and they mostly just felt like weak barricades. Now the HD remaster has DLC, and I tried it all. The music DLC I found was a waste of money and time. I never really battled in the overworld, and I didn't really spend that much time traversing overworld, so I never really got to hear that much of the music, which was ill-fitting because it's high resolution or it's old sounding, and for the most part it's upbeat, so they don't really fit the tone of Nocturne. It's definitely not the best use of money. I would have preferred it to be tracks that affected other battles, swapping out battle music, shuffling between any of these randomly. Any of those would be a better optimization for this sort of DLC, as then it would have actually been more of something that fans could enjoy in the bulk of the game rather than the moments outside of the bulk of the game. Suffice to say, there's not a whole lot of incentive to explore the overworld, so as a result, the only time that you're really there for a long period of time is traversing one key area to the next, and once you've done it once, you can just teleport. For the 2 item area DLC, I'll say this. You can kind of cheese it, but it's weird, and it is only really worth it if you're trying to steamroll to get all the trophies. Some people will enjoy doing that sort of thing, and I kind of did enjoy myself, as it hits the part of me that really likes the payoff of doing little work while also being very repetitive in the actions that you're taking. The dungeons you access are these variations of Yoyogi Park for the money items and Shinjuku Hospital for the EXP items. I spent most of the time exploring the Shinjuku Hospital because I didn't really need Maka at any point in time. You can get them by encountering Mitama in this recolored hospital area, and when I was testing this out, I used the items mostly for evolving demons and also just seeing the general encounter rates. If you want to cheese it, go to merciful mode and use Riberama and the flute. You also want to go to the hardest area each time And all this to have the highest possible spawn rate with the lowest difficulty setting. Though if you're early in game with this DLC, I would recommend staying in the low level areas, which is the first area. The reason you need Riverama is simply because the spawn rate is a lot lower on Merciful mode, and that extends to these DLC areas as well. The money item area has the same pitfalls. I only found this useful for getting money for the sole purpose of buying Magatama and for completing the Demon Compendium. And to be honest, that's pretty much the only purposes that I could see for this. The other major gameplay change was the selection mechanic. I tried playing the game on hard and surprise, surprise, being able to make perfect demons quickly reduces the difficulty setting quite a bit, but it feels worse than normal mode. In my opinion, this is something that should have been locked behind Merciful, since it reduces the quality of play. If you still want to experiment, you can shuffle instead with a button press, and I like the idea that you don't have to go in and out of menus anymore. And the suspend save is nice. I never really used it on the Switch or PS5 because I don't really turn off my consoles. I just let them go to rest. I could see the benefit of this if you're not like me and you actually play other games and rotate. My big complaint is that I wish the map was accessible on the main screen that you're traversing instead of a button press to go to another screen. I use maps religiously, even if I know the game very well, which for this one I do. It bothers me that there isn't an option to just make that accessible via button or just on the screen by default, and it's a complaint that I saw from some Japanese fans as well. And I want to talk about the localization. I cannot think of a bigger improvement than this. The old release of the West had so many changes, in part due to the character limits. This one not only fixes those, but also changes dialogue to be more natural, and of course to be more in line with the original sentiment, instead of simply being a literal interpretation. Though I will say that some of the humor has been changed a bit, and I don't necessarily agree with all changes. The story elements that have been localized and enhanced, I believe are a net positive though. And while I would have preferred words like the Amalo Network being changed to the Amara Meridian, I don't think that keeping them this way is necessarily wrong, as it still gets across the same message, and it's easier in concept for Westerners to understand. And touching on what I like about the story, I simply just like how rich the story is because of the environments being rich. Admittedly, it could be a little frustrating that they expect you to either be interested in researching or having a pretty good knowledge of Buddhism, Hinduism, and things of that nature. I think it could be a bit of a net negative for people who have prior knowledge of the franchise, because they'll want to fit what they know about other titles into this game, and it just ends up fighting the design of the game. That includes applying law, neutral, and chaos alignments to the reason characters, and trying to fit the game itself onto a timeline. I personally think that because it so firmly tries to change things, it makes people try hard to see how they could fit it in any way, and that misses the point, in my opinion. I've played all versions of the HD remaster, with exception to the Steam one. The way it plays on the Switch is frankly embarrassing to me. I find it inexcusable that the initial release was so poor and it took nearly 6 months to get the game to the point where it is. I don't think it's acceptable for the game to be released acceptable for Western fans at the cost of the entire Asian region. I hate the lack of transparency Atlas displayed too, because even in the update info for the patches, the info was simply vague. We don't even get to know via official Atlas statement, nor do we get an apology for the way it's been handled thus far. At first I thought this was a far cry from Atlas recalling SMT2 on PS1 where they inadvertently added a game-breaking bug, but it's actually on par with every SMT2 release having tons of bugs and them never truly fixing the game completely, and instead going so far as to include a list of bugs that you can avoid. When I first set out to talk about this, I was upset that Atlas had changed, but when looking at the full scope, this is actually a typical Atlas response. And I'm just shocked because I expected better. One thing that hasn't been fixed is the screen flickering. Regardless of which version you play, there is indeed screen flickering, meaning it'll randomly go black, just for a short time. And it happens consistently throughout the game. It's not something that existed in the PS2 versions, but it's here in HD. I'll say that on the PS5, the game runs so smoothly that it's basically exactly the same as the PS2 version. But that doesn't mean much when most people don't have a PS5. Playing it on the PS4 Pro, you can still see some visible lag and frame rate drops. This leads me to discuss the price point, and then factor in that it's locked at 30 frames per second. I find this game to be a solid $20 to $30 game. It doesn't improve enough to add that much to the price. The localization and voice acting are great, but the way the game performs, especially on Switch, the way some graphics are improved while most isn't, the way the music is still compressed, it all brings it quite down for me. There's also no physical or digital manual, which is a detriment to those who are going to pick this game up and want a straightforward guide to the gameplay. And my personal largest complaint is there's no collector's edition, just a digital deluxe in the West, which is something that will likely persist, and I hate that. I love the useless knickknacks and the CD and the art book, and while not everything featured in a typical collector's edition would have been neat, simply translating the Ayakashi Monthly that was bundled in the collector's edition in Japan and bundling it with the Duke of Pianite soundtrack or the Rares soundtrack or any other soundtrack would have sufficed and been great for any fans of the game. I'm glad more people will play Nocturne as a result of this release, but I also think this is a poor representation of Nocturne. The game isn't fundamentally changed like Strange Journey Redux, but I don't think the price of admission is truly worth it. There's a lot of caveats that incentivize people into purchasing it, such as we gotta support it so they make more of these, or it's my favorite game, I have to support it. But I don't think this is a way to support something unless you're vocal about the things you like and don't like. And for me, I have to be vocal. I don't like the lack of transparency. I don't like the middling improvements to the graphics. I don't like how expensive it is. This extends to the parts of Asia that didn't even get Raidou, and we still don't know why. The only statement we got is for the one region of China that didn't get him initially because they were afraid fans would be upset due to his design, meaning that this is likely a choice Sega and Atlus made rather than a restriction by those regions as originally thought. It breaks my heart when we look at the way that the fans reacted in those regions. They're just simply begging for Atlus and Sega to respond and to give them a reason why. They even made a petition to get him in, and that was ignored. While I'll say a lot of my negative association really comes from Atlus themselves, in addition to the game, I'd say this game is overall worth picking up on PS5 and Steam, though I'd say wait for a sale. In closing, I'll just use this chance to say that it's actually called Forced Battle, not Fierce Battle. The song doesn't say one more god rejected. Yahweh isn't in Nocturne and you don't punch him or reject him or anything. Please do multiple endings in this game. True Demon ending is not the canon ending. Nocturne also exists in a vacuum and only connects to SMT4 due to the DLC shenanigans. So if I had to quantify this game with a number, the original release of Nocturne is an 8 out of 10 for me. This version is something like a 5 or a 6 out of 10. The contributing factors being the bugs, the slowdown, the other things I mentioned, and the things I mentioned about Atlus themselves. I want to thank you guys all for watching this weird development history and review thing. I know I didn't go into the plot specifically because even with talking about the reasons and the way they end up, I don't think that I've spoiled enough of the actual gameplay for you to know that stuff without, not enjoying the game. I think that even knowing the reason, people, and their endings, it's still quite a bit to get through, And this video was really a passion project for me. I truly love Nocturne. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Even though I didn't state a lot of opinions in this video, I hope you don't take my opinions as fact. Form your own opinions based on your own experience. I'm not the end-all be-all, and you should feel comfortable in knowing that. Thanks again, buyee, for sponsoring this video. Thanks for watching, everyone. And goodbye, fellow Megatenists.